ahead and we'll get started. We'll go into our second lesson here. We're going to part 2 of, can we keep the commandments? And we've gone through that verse before. I believe it's in the book of John. Talks about, if you love me, keep my commandments. And of course, a lot of different denominations and church groups, they always say, well, yeah, I'm keeping all the commandments. And of course, I love Jesus. So of course, I'm keeping all his commandments. And so maybe nobody's ever actually sat down and read all the commandments. They may see, well, I've read all the 10 commandments. And then that's when you say, well, no, there's actually 613 commandments. And so last week we went through and we looked at the commandments, all of them, all 14 of them that dealt, I think 14 or 12 that dealt with brotherhood and citizenship and loving your neighbor as yourself. And those weren't little sayings and those weren't little good thoughts. Those were commandments. Those were laws of the nations you had to do. If you weren't loving your neighbor as yourself, essentially, and just as the example, you could, the police could come, pick you up, take you away, throw you in jail. And of course, not really the police, but I'm just using that as the parallel example to what we have going on here, that you could have someone, come along and take you away for not loving your neighbor as yourself. If you were holding a grudge, if you were, just to look at something, if you were cherishing hatred in your heart, that's something we looked at last week. That was Leviticus 17, I'm sorry. If you didn't rebuke somebody, if they had done wrong, that was breaking the law. So we had gone through multiple laws, seeing that are people doing this today when they say that they are keeping the commandments? Of course not. So every day, hour by hour, we're breaking the laws, and we don't even know that we are, because there's 613 laws, and if we would have to simultaneously keep all 613 and recognize that we are, we would constantly always be guilty. And that's the point, is that's what the law did. Romans 3:19 says, by the law, 3:19 and 20 says, by the law is the knowledge of sin. And for you to attain perfection under the law, you'd have to keep all these laws perfect, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And of course, even the book of James says, if you break one law, it's as if you broke them all. So if you kept 612 points of law, but you broke one, you're as guilty as breaking them all. So the law never justifies you or saves you or whatever it is. It shows you you're the sinner. And so that means it points you to someone, I need to be saved from myself because I'm a guilty sinner. This is what this is pointing out to me.
Could I interject?
I'm sorry?
Could I interject?
Yeah.
So why couldn't you? Like, what are the ones that you couldn't follow today, even if you tried?
What'd you say?
Which laws could you not follow, even if you tried today?
Well, there's some that, as you read the list of, say, 613 of them, some of them are meant to say, as a Jew, when you go out to the Gentiles, make sure that you, as we'll look at tonight, make sure you charge them certain tax. Make sure you don't vex the Gentile as you do the Jew. Make sure that when you go to war, fighting the nations, that you fight a war under these certain laws and commandments. And those are the commandments of God that are written in the Bible that people say that they claim that they're obeying. So they would be, whether it's fighting a war, imposing a tax, they're meant for the Jew to do to, in some cases, the Gentile. And some of them are also saying when you're forbidden to marry an Amalekite. Those are laws that we have no business. It has nothing to do with us. But yet the law states that a Jew is not to marry an Amalekite. That's again another law in there. All having to do with the righteousness that would have to do the standard that would have to do with what's going on in prophecy. So those are just some examples. But that's the idea there.
Also laws that state that if you're something about your children, if they don't act properly or something.
Oh yeah. And then there's other laws that say if your children are rebellious, go ahead and stone them, kill them.
Well, I don't see why you couldn't do that. I mean, you could.
I mean, you literally could go and do that, but then you would literally be arrested for life, and you couldn't literally obey any further laws.
That just came up recently.
Yeah, so that's, you don't gain righteousness today because God's doing something totally different. God can't be dispensing grace and imposing laws like that when the whole point is to see individual souls saved and saints edified, and yet having a law saying that when somebody is so much as rebellious, go ahead and stone them and kill them. So that's two different things, and God wouldn't be double-minded like that. Of course, we can do all sorts of things we find in the Bible. We can build an ark, we can stone our kids, we can do all sorts of things that we find, but that's what gets us into trouble, is the failure to write the instructions that we find. So, but I mean, you're asking a good question there. It's what people are not asking, and it's exactly what you're bringing up. So it's a great point. Why can't we go ahead and obey all these things? It's because a lot of it's written in context to Israel under law. And today, when you try to obey some of these laws, they can actually get you arrested and fined, and it'll destroy your life. Execute. If you try to obey these laws, some of them, it'll destroy your life. So, in proper dispensation, under the proper audiences, they fit. That's why it's a necessity we rightly divide the word of truth, so that information fits what it should with the proper audiences. So we got that, but we'll kind of pick up where we're at. And that's kind of just seeing like we went through last week. We saw Levitical brotherhood and citizenship and the laws and the rules for them. And we can learn a lot from it. There's nothing wrong with reading and seeing some good information in all of it. We see a lot about reconciliation and how things were supposed to work for the Jew under law and how it fit for them. And if we benefit from any instruction, we could learn some spiritual lessons from it, of course. And that's what we look to do and learn from it. We saw that from last week. And we can even look at it this week as we go through and we read about how, as we broke down Proverbs theme by theme for 7 lessons a while back, we'll look through and we'll see here when we look at the law. We'll see that when we look at the laws this time, not so much dealing with brotherhood and citizenship, but we're looking at how Israel dealt with business practices within their 12 tribes, within their camps and everything else. We'll see there, as we take a look, we'll take a look at about, say, 15 commandments or so. You can see that we know that there's the 10 that are known common demand: thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, and so on and so forth. We know the basic 10. But as we look at these now, we're going to see the ones that are all categorized under the theme of business and commerce and everything else for Israel under law. So we look at Leviticus chapter 25, verse 14. We'll start with this one. And this is, instead, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, shalt not essentially. So this is something interesting to see it. And again, different audience, different times. So we're seeing here, most companies break this one here. Well, we'll see it here. Leviticus 25:14 says, and if thou sell aught unto thy neighbor, or buyest aught of thy neighbor's hand, ye shall not oppress one another. So no trying to get a benefit for yourself so much as make everything equal and no oppressing anybody. 14. And we got some cross references. If we look at Leviticus 19, verse 13. Leviticus 19, verse 13. There's a good cross reference just a couple chapters back. It says, thou shalt not defraud thy neighbor, neither rob him. The wages of him that is hired shall not abide with thee all night until the morning. And so you're seeing you're not to defraud anybody. So the price of whatever it may be has to remain fair, just, not even, towards you in favor. It has to be always fair, always just. If not, you're breaking the laws of God. Everyone's, sold something or bought something at a price one way or another in life, and the laws of God have been broken. If it hasn't been at a just price or bought at a just price or whatever it may be, but that's just to show, again, by the law is the knowledge of sin. We're not saved by keeping the laws, but we are taking a look at them. So it's just interesting to see that. But thou shalt not defraud thy neighbor, neither rob him. Most of us don't go around robbing our neighbors, at least not with a gun, not with a knife, but In general, we're just seeing that we're taking a look at this, and the wages of him that is hired shall not abide with thee all night until the morning. So usually when this is essentially saying is you've got, say, a paycheck to give out, and of course Israel has no literal paycheck or time clock or whatever, but don't hold on to that until the next day. When it's time to give out the money, give out the money, is what they're saying here. When it's a proper time to distribute what needs to be distributed as far as money goes, that's what you do. So we see that there in Leviticus 19:13 being a cross-reference for Leviticus 25:14. If we look at Ezekiel 22, verse 17, we'll see this society got worse and worse and worse. They were breaking, judgment was coming upon them. We looked at the 5 courses of judgment last week. So we're seeing Ezekiel rebuke, as he should, Israel. That's Ezekiel 22, verse 7. We just saw whether you buy or whether you sell, you're not to oppress anybody. By the time you get to the book of Ezekiel through God's timeline, there's oppression. And it says in Ezekiel 22, verse 7, in thee have they set light by father and mother. In the midst of thee have they dealt by oppression with the stranger. In thee have they vexed the fatherless and the widow. And so that's not good. We're seeing their oppression. They're dealing with oppression with the stranger and the fatherless and the widow. So they're taking advantage, Israel is, at this point in time, of anyone they can. And especially the fatherless, the widow, so on and so forth. That's not a good sign for them. Verse 12 in Ezekiel 22 goes on to read, in thee have they taken gifts to shed blood. Thou hast taken usury and increase, and thou hast greedily gained of thy neighbors by extortion, and hast forgotten me, saith the Lord God. Behold, therefore, I have spent in my hand at thy dishonest gain, which thou hast made, and at thy blood which has been in the midst of thee. So we're seeing there the Lord's response to Israel's lack of keeping taken a look at, amongst many other things. This is just a list of some ones we're looking at tonight. But they've become corrupt. Israel now falls into these certain courses of wrath, that we looked at last week. And so we're seeing him saying, you've taken gifts to shed blood. You've gone into oppressing the people, Israel. You've taken usury and increase. That's a phrase that's called 5-6, where you take 5. You take 5 and you charge them 6. So essentially you're increasing. You're adding with interest usury to somebody, and that's unjust for what we're seeing as far as business practices in Israel. He says, thou hast greedily gained of thy neighbors by extortion. And so we're seeing the practices of Israel is getting further and further corrupt as God's timeline goes on. And it says, and has forgotten. The reason why all this is happening is that they've forgotten the Lord and everything that they're going through. So we see that here in Ezekiel 22. And so we've read this before. We've seen this last week when it came to deal with Levitical brotherhood, but we're seeing this idea come up. God is upset at what's happening. So we're seeing this in the first one. If we go back to Leviticus, we'll take a look at the second one there. And there's so many more cross-references, but for time's sake, we'll keep it at maybe 1 or 2 or 3 cross-references. The next one we'll go to Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 14. Leviticus 25, verse 14. And what we're seeing here, interestingly enough, is they're not to make a loan to any one of the 12 tribes, any Jews, any Hebrews, with interest. Now, when it comes to the Gentiles, this is what Ryan was asking earlier. Here's one of the laws right here. If you have a stranger that comes, if you're a Hebrew, if you're one of the 12 members of the 12 tribes of Israel, and if you're a Jew, you're not going to loan with interest to another Jew. You're not going to do that. They're your brethren. They're one of your tribesmen. They're your countrymen. If someone comes in from another nation a Gentile, you can go ahead and charge that interest because they're not one of the 12 tribes. They're not one of God's special people. You can go ahead and do the business practices that God says. We'll read that right here. It says here in Leviticus 25:14. I'm sorry, 25:37. Right? No, where am I at?
37, Leviticus.
25:37?
Not the name. Yeah. Yeah.
25:37, sorry. Reading all over the place here. Shall not give him thy money upon usury, nor lend him thy victuals for increase. I am the Lord your God, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. Talking to Jews. He didn't bring out any other nation out of the land of Egypt. He brought Israel out of the land of Egypt. But he says that in verse 37, thou shalt not give him, when it talks about it's back in verse 35, where it leads into verse 37, if thy brother be waxen poor, thy brother, a member of Israel, if thy brother be waxen poor and fallen in decay with thee, then thou shalt relieve, yea, though he be a stranger or sojourning, that he may live with thee. That's talking about the brother, a stranger in that section of one section of Israel to another section of Israel. He may be a stranger in that section, but he's your brother. So take thou no usury of him or increase, but fear thy God that thy brother may live with thee. Thou shalt not give him thy money upon usury, nor lend him thy victuals for increase. So it's all about, when it comes to this, that they know one Jew for another Jew put on that usury, that increase. If we look at Exodus 22:25 as a cross-reference, Exodus 22:25. You see the same thing written in a different way.
I know.
Exodus 22:25 says, if thou lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee, thou shalt not be to him as a usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury. So we see it again in Exodus 22, verse 25. If thou lend money to any of my people that is poor, by thee, thou shalt not be to him as a usurer. So it comes up twice. We see in Exodus 22, we see in Leviticus as well. So it comes up like that. So we're seeing that there in, see it in Leviticus 25, Exodus 22. If you look at Deuteronomy 23, let's see. See another one. Still dealing with the same law. Deuteronomy 23. It's going to be 23, verse 19. And here's where we see the difference between a Hebrew with a Hebrew and a Hebrew with someone who's not a Hebrew. Deuteronomy 23, verse 19 says, thou shalt not lend upon usury to thy brother. Thou shalt not lend upon usury to thy brother, usury of money, usury of victuals, usury of anything that is lent upon usury. Unto a stranger thou mayest lend upon usury, but unto thy brother thou shalt not lend upon usury, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all that thou settest thy hand to in the land whither thou goest to possess it. So we see a difference, and it's specifically in Deuteronomy 23. This is what Brian was bringing up earlier. These are some of the laws we couldn't obey today if we tried, because this is saying if you've got one member of Israel dealing with another member of Israel, you can go ahead and waive the interest. But when you have another member of Israel dealing with a stranger into Israel, you've got to charge them the interest. These are the laws of God, and we all break them today because we can't obey them. We're not this audience and this dealing with the laws of God. So we see that in Deuteronomy 23, verse 19 and 20. And so this goes on here. But then as we continue and we go to the next law dealing with business practices under law, that of course we're not under, it's just not to borrow on interest. And that's Deuteronomy 23:20, where we are now. That's, Deuteronomy 23:20 goes on and says, just not to borrow on interest. And that's what we're seeing there is, unto the stranger thou mayest lend upon usury, but unto thy brother thou shalt not lend upon usury. Just repeating the same thing, giving the difference about, making sure you do or don't use charging that interest, in what situations is interest to be given or not given. So we see that there. And that's not to borrow on interest. We look at Deuteronomy 15, verse 3. Just a couple chapters back, you see more cross references in dealing with this. See, Deuteronomy 15, verse 3. And we see it again. It says, of a foreigner thou mayest exact it again, but that which is thine with thine brother, thine hand shall release. Now, of course, it's talking, idea, we see in verse 2, every creditor that lendeth aught unto his neighbor shall release it. He ought not exact it of his neighbor or of his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. It's talking about, a bit of a release, but nonetheless, you're seeing how it's dealt more favorably, Hebrew upon Hebrew, than it is Hebrew upon non-Hebrew. The same concept is coming out that we're seeing it, whether it be in Deuteronomy 15 or Deuteronomy 24, or throughout the course of the pages of Israel, we're seeing in the Old Testament under law that the law leans in the favor of Israel more so than it does than the stranger. We were, as we read from Paul, that Ephesians 2:11 says we were strangers of the covenants during this time. We were all Gentiles. So we would have to be charged with a tax from a Jew if we were to go into Israel and so on and so forth. And those were the business practices under law. So we see that there. And if we look at Proverbs 19, verse 17 as a cross-reference, Proverbs 19:17. Say more about lending and when to lend, how to lend, how it works. It says, he that hath pity upon the poor lendeth unto the Lord, and that which he hath given will he pay him again. So we see how Proverbs can actually work out as a result from what we're reading in Leviticus and how it goes into the Proverbs and how Proverbs cross-refer back to Leviticus, so on and so forth, and how we spent 7 lessons in Proverbs, seeing how a lot of it leads back to Leviticus, and it all leads back to prophecy, and how things all go back to things under law. So we're seeing how the interesting connections are made, and so this works out here. But so far we've seen not to do wrong in buying and selling, otherwise the laws are broken. Not to make a loan to any Jew on interest. We're seeing this so far, not to borrow on interest. And so those are just the first 3 out of 15. We can think of some that have already broken this law multiple times, or these laws multiple times, and that's the point. Romans 3 is saying by the law is the knowledge of sin. And Galatians 3:24 and 25 is that the law is a schoolmaster to bring you to someone, and that's the Lord Jesus Christ in his work on the cross, that saves us and makes grace more appreciative and necessary. So we see that there. If we look to the next one, we're going to look at Exodus 22, verse 25. And this is kind of where we just were, kind of looking at this on purpose. And it's pretty much not to take part in any transactional usury between borrower and lender, whether it be as a witness, whether it be as a writer of the bond. You're just not to take part in any of this. And so it says, if thou lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee, thou shalt not be to him as a usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury. So it's the whole idea of when there's a Hebrew upon Hebrew transaction taking place, you're not to take part of any of that extra interest. You're not to be a witness to it. You're not to be a part of it. You're not to be an interactive party to it. And that was, by the time, as we read from those verses in Ezekiel, they were all about it, as a matter of fact. They were actually looking to rip people off. The Israel was. We saw that they were attacking the widow. They were attacking the poor. And Ezekiel was warning them. And God was also, upset at that. We saw that in the book of Ezekiel. As they kept becoming more and more corrupt, that's what finally led to them being carried away into Babylon. But we see this here. Exodus 22, verse 25 is where we are. And if we look, we'll see even more. If we look at Jeremiah 15, in verse 10. See, Jeremiah 15, verse 10, Jeremiah and Ezekiel are going to be dealing with corrupt Israel that are no longer going to be upholding the law as they should. And so they're going to rebuke Israel. And we find this. It's Jeremiah 15, verse 10, which says, "Woe is me, my mother, that thou hast borne me, a man of strife and a man of contention to the whole earth. I have neither lent on usury, nor men have lent to me on usury. Yet everyone doth curse me." So he's making it a point to say, I'm not a bad guy. I've done nothing wrong to Israel. Why are they yelling at me? But the way he's saying it, he's making it to say that, I've neither lent on usury. I'm not a bad guy that does something like this. Israel is. But yet he's making the point to express himself in a way. It's kind of like us saying today, why are they yelling at me? I'm only trying to give them the gospel. I'm only trying to see souls saved, and they think I'm the bad guy. This is what Jeremiah is saying here in Jeremiah 15:10. He's saying, I've neither lent on usury, neither have I lent, nor have men have lent to me on usury. He's using that as the point that he's making. He says, yet everyone doth curse me. So it's interesting to see he uses that as the example when he expresses himself. He's talking about usury. So we say that in Jeremiah 15:10 because Israel is becoming more and more corrupt. And when we go to Ezekiel, here and again, we're going to see Ezekiel talking about this again. And as we go there, we're going to see Ezekiel 18, verse 8. And that's Ezekiel 18, verse 8. Goes forth to say that he that hath not given forth upon usury, neither hath taken any increase, that hath withdrawn his hand from iniquity, hath executed true judgment between man and man, hath walked in my statutes, and hath kept my judgments to deal truly. He is just, he shall surely live, saith the Lord God. So he's describing, certain, if a man be just, he's going to do this, he's going to do that. And we're seeing that there. He hath not given forth upon usury, that's if he's just. Neither hath taken any increase, that's if he's just. That means he's obeying the laws that specifically are in Leviticus, that Jeremiah was expressing that, I'm not doing this, and yet Israel has a problem with him. That hath withdrawn his hand from iniquity, hath executed true judgment, and so on and so forth. Hath walked in my statutes, that's what we see in verse 9, has kept my judgments, which would be statutes, judgments, laws, covenants. That's time for Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Leviticus, Moses, everything. He is just, he shall surely live, saith the Lord God. And it goes on from there. And if we continue in verse 13 of Ezekiel 18, Ezekiel 18:13 says, hath given forth upon usury and hath taken increase. Now we're looking at those who are the ones that are oppressing. It says, has given forth upon usury and hath taken increase. Shall he then live? He shall not live. He hath done all these abominations, he shall surely die, his blood shall be upon him. So we're seeing those that go forth and actually continue in financial gain and usury by breaking these laws found in Leviticus, found in Deuteronomy, found in Exodus. They're saying, are they going to continue to live? And Ezekiel's saying, no, they're not just, they're going to die. And their blood is going to be upon them. They're doing all these, as he says, abominations. So he says this here in Ezekiel 18. And we're seeing how dire they are, how important they are to everything. For us today, we see it, and it's a normal part of common society. For here, these are law-breaking consequences. These are severe ordinances. You could die by adding interest to something. This is the law. These are the laws of God in the Old Testament under prophecy. And so we see how important it is and how we're not meant to keep these laws. These are not laws meant for the dispensation of grace. Now, we can learn something from this. And whatever spiritual lesson we get from this that works today for the dispensation of grace, if we can find some benefit to this, say it's right to be fair, it's right to be honest, it's right to be good, it's right to deal in a wholesome business practice, I can learn something like that from these laws. It's right to do good business, to have good business practice, we could say. Learning that from these laws is something that we're picking up from this. But to try to find our salvation by doing this, we're never going to have it. But a lot of people may not know what they're saying when they're in different denominations and so forth. And they say, oh, I'm keeping all of God's laws. Or I think the law can save me. Or I think the laws of God in the Old Testament are capable of saving everybody and anybody or whatever it may be. Or I'm keeping all of God's commandments. We're finding just through 4 or 5 of the commandments out of the 613, that's not possible. So, and we'll continue with more. If we look at Exodus, again, 22:25, going back to that one again. Exodus 22:25, where we were a short while ago. We go into the next one. Exodus 22:25 reads again, just as if thou lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee, thou shalt not be to him as a usury, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury. We were talking about usury for the past couple of laws, interest, so on and so forth, but it does make a point to say something else. And it says, if thou lend money to any of my people that is poor. So it's talking about, make sure you, and Paul even says, remember the poor. And so, it talks about a law, and we're talking about, lending to the poor. We can think about many where we didn't give to the poor. We're not talking about the like the lazy who won't work. We're talking about the actual poor. So we see this here, and there's a difference between the two. Because Paul says today, if you don't work, you don't eat. So people need to get up and provide for themselves. Provision for oneself is what you do in the dispensation of grace. But there are those who are poor, and we're seeing here, if you lend money to any of my people that is poor, that means there are people in different financial statuses in Old Testament Israel. And if you lend money to somebody, in this case, we're reading from Exodus 22:25, you're not to impact them with interest. You're not to hit them up with interest. And that's what they weren't to do. So, but unless they were to lend to the poor, that was a law. So we see that there. The best cross-reference is, again, Proverbs. And that's Proverbs 22:7. Proverbs 22:7, we might have heard this before. And different studies or studies about money, studies about business, studies about whatever it may be. But this is a good summary of a lot of things about what we're looking at now. And it says, the rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. And so this is something you hear, maybe you hear it when they talk about economic debt and on the TV or social media, whatever it may be. But the borrower is servant to the lender. And that's a true statement even today. It's not only a good spiritual lesson, it's a true statement. But the rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. So it's a true fact there. We see this here. But again, this goes back to Leviticus, where we're seeing this in Leviticus, we're seeing this in Exodus 22:25. We're seeing it based on these rules. It's working its way into Proverbs, as it should, and it cross-refers back and forth. These are all things that work out well. If we go to, we'll just reread it again. It's the same one, Exodus 22:25, about lending money to any of the people that are poor and impacting with interest. And this is not to demand from the poor person repayment of his debt when the creditor knows that he can't pay it. So if we look at Nehemiah, chapter 5, verse 2. That's the book of Nehemiah, chapter 5. We're going to see here something of interest as well. I get to it as well. Let's see. There we go. Nehemiah, chapter 5. There we go. Chapter 5, verse 2. as you're going through these laws, and you're saying there's no way that business today could ever work like this, you're right, because this is different audience, different dispensation, different laws, different rules, different commandments for different people in different times, which is why rightly dividing the word of truth makes sense, because this all fits for them. This is all their truth. This is all truth that is going to completely work as they do what they should. And it will give them a standard of righteousness and a covenant standing where they keep it, it's good. They don't keep it, it's bad. They get blessings and cursings and so on and so forth. They get a New Testament where all these laws are written in their heart and they can supernaturally obey it in their kingdom. These laws just don't work for us today, but it's good to learn them, good to study them, good to see what they have to say. But in Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 2, we go there and we see, for there was that said, we, our sons and our daughters are many. Therefore, we take up corn for them that we may eat and live. So it starts out like that. And it goes on to say, some also there were that said, we have mortgaged our lands, vineyards, and houses that we might buy corn because of the dearth. There were also that said, we have borrowed money for the king's tribute, and that upon our lands and vineyards. Yet now our flesh is as the flesh of our children and as their children. And lo, we bring into bondage our sons and our daughters to be servants, and some of our daughters are brought into bondage already. Neither is it in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and their vineyards. So it starts out like this. And if we look at verse 7, he says, Then I consulted with myself, and I rebuked the nobles and the rulers, and said unto them, Ye exact usury, every one of his brother. And I set a great assembly against them. And I said unto them, We after our ability have redeemed our brethren the Jews, which were sold unto the heathen. And will ye even sell your brethren? Or shall they be sold unto us? Then they held their peace and found nothing to answer. Also, I said, It is not good that ye do. Ought ye not to walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of the heathen, our enemies? I likewise, and my brethren, and my servants, might exact of them money and corn. I pray you, let us leave off this usury. So Nehemiah, in this book, they're talking about usury. They're saying, you leave it off, don't use it. We got enough trouble already. We sold our houses for corn, we sold our brethren for food and so on and so forth. Now let's leave off the usury. Let's not bring in usury into all this. They're remembering the law. Laws in Leviticus, laws in Exodus, dealing with usury, and said, let's not bring interest into this. Let's not go back into dealing with all these problems that have to deal with interest, where it's just going to compound sin. It's just going to add more sin, more problems, more troubles. Verse 11, Restore, I pray you, to them, even this day, their lands, their vineyards, their olive yards, and their houses, also to the 100th part of the money, and of the corn, and the wine, and the oil that ye exact of them. He's telling you, be fair in how you deal and buy and sell, and don't use this just like the laws we're looking at today. It's essentially Nehemiah is trying to teach them how to get back into being under the law. Don't be restore everything. Don't be so think of the word, but they're taking so much away from everybody to the part where they're trying to sell their houses just to buy corn. And so they're saying, restore everybody. Don't just take things away from everybody, especially from your brethren, Israel. So we're seeing as this is being played out in Nehemiah there. So and it's interesting to read that in the book of Nehemiah. There's a lot going on in this book, and usury is just one little piece of it there in chapter 5. So we see that there. That's something that plays pretty well there. The next one is an interesting one. We look at Deuteronomy 24. Verse 6. It's an interesting law, and this is another one where this is something you could do, but you don't really see too much of. But anything's possible. So let's go to Deuteronomy 24, verse 6. For 24. All right, let me see. Yep, Deuteronomy 24, 6. There we go. And it says, No man shall take the nether or the upper millstone to pledge, for he hath or for he taketh a man's life to pledge. Now you read that first, you're going to say, well, what's that mean? What's this talking about? But the millstone was how they would go forth and they would use that to make a meal out of something. The millstone, that's like a utensil, or in a sense, a wheel. It'd be used to prepare food, and if you took it, if you say, well, if you want to buy something, whatever it is, I'm going to take that millstone from you, and you can get it back when you pay me back. But I'll give you some of XYZ, but you got to give me your millstone. But now, if you take away the millstone, that prepares all the food that they would put the corn up against, or they would put the whatever it is, grain or corn or something, and they would use it to make their food. But they have no way to make food. And so what this law says is you're not to take somebody's way of making food, way of making their essential way of survival. Don't take that away from them as a pledge. Don't take that away from them as means of, if you're going to tell somebody you owe me this or whatever it is, don't take away their essentials, is what it's saying. Don't take away their basic necessities. The law says you're not going to do that. There's a law. You do not take away what someone needs to survive on as a pledge. And that's what you're seeing here in Deuteronomy 24, verse 6. Thou, no man shall take the nether or the upper millstone to pledge, for he taketh a man's life to pledge. And then go and you say, someone, are you obeying Deuteronomy 24, 6? Have you ever taken away somebody's millstone when you are dealing with somebody in business? You say, what? It's because we're not under these laws. But yet that is a law. That's one of the 613 points of law. Dealing with business. You're not going to take away somebody's millstone when you deal with them in business. And you're just like, okay, I won't do that. But this meant the world to Israel's society, the 12 tribes, Israel under law with Moses. This worked for them. This was like a safety net, that no one was going to take away their means of survival. So this is what we see here. And as we see that there, we'll take a look at Exodus 22, verse 26. I believe we'll see something along the same lines as a cross-reference in Exodus 22, 26. Again, it's just interesting to see these laws, just to see what they have to say, just to know that these are rules and laws about business, business and commerce. When someone says, I'm obeying all the laws, you could show them, take away anyone's millstone lately. That should hopefully bring up a conversation. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it gets more questions on their part to say, what are you talking about? Well, let's talk. Let's go further into a conversation. Exodus 22, verse 26. This is a similar one. This is something similar where you're not taking away the millstone, but it also says not to take other things away too. And it says, if thou at all take thy neighbor's raiment to pledge, thou shalt deliver it unto him by that the sun goeth down. For that is his covering only. It is his raiment, for his shall he sleep. And and it shall come to pass when he crieth unto me that I will hear, for I am gracious. This is God's law. Again, the raiment is, you find that in the book of Timothy, but he's talking about food and raiment there with be content, clothing. In other words, a synonym for clothing. So he's saying, if you're going to go and you're going to say, well, okay, I'll give you, in our business transaction, I'll give you X, Y, and Z, but you're going to give me the clothes on your back. You're going to give me your clothes. You're going to give me the shirt off your back, literally. This law says, no, I can't do that. I can't take your millstone, in which that's how you make food for yourself, and I can't take the shirt off your back. Literally. And that's Exodus 22, 26. I literally can't take the shirt off your back. And I literally can't take how you provide food for yourself. Now, through that millstone that grinds up the corn and grinds up the grain and grinds up everything else, you can continue to wear your clothes and you can continue to make food for yourself. So you can live, exist, essentially. You won't be without anything. But it's interesting to see, I believe it's in verse 26. It says that if thou at all take thy neighbor's raiment to pledge, thou shalt deliver it unto him by that the sun goeth down. And if you think about some of those verses you read from Paul in Ephesians, So don't let the sun go down upon your wrath. There's some laws that talk about you do this only until the sun goes down. What does it say exactly? Thou shalt deliver it unto him by that the sun goeth down. So the sun that goeth down, don't let the sun go down upon your wrath and give it back by the sun go down. The sun, that could mean something. There's an interesting study in that. We won't do it now and we won't do it tonight. But there's that phrase, the sun goeth down. There's a couple of Pauline verses that talk about the sun going down upon your wrath. There's a couple of laws saying the sun going down. So there's some good cross references where it talks about that. A lot of people say, what does that mean, the sun going down? Well, it might go back to the law. It might go back to a certain point of the day where things need to be settled. Things need to be wrapped up by a certain, whether it's your anger or returning somebody their property or whatever it is. But the point of the day where things need to be wrapped up could be when the sun goes down. Just a possible thought. So again, that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother study, but nonetheless, we're seeing that in Exodus chapter 22. And so where are we at here? We're looking at Exodus 22. We see it also come up, it's just a short phrase in Isaiah chapter 47, verse 2. When you see there, and it's Isaiah 47, verse 2, I believe it's just going to be a short phrase. When I was looking through this, it was a interesting phrase, but they make a mention of this. And it's the idea of the millstone, because that's the law we're looking at. You know, to take the millstone away from somebody. Well, we see here reference to it. We see a point where it's made. It says, take the millstones, Isaiah 47:2, take the millstones and grind meal, and cover the ox and bear the leg, and cover the thigh and pass over the river. So you're seeing where they say, take the millstones and grind your meal with it. So there's the point of it. There's the purpose of it. There's the use of a millstone. You also see where they say you'd better if they take a millstone and throw it around your neck and throw them in the sea, I think in Revelation or Matthew. But there's the millstone. There's the purpose of the millstone. There's the point of the millstone. So we see that there. And it's just interesting to see that as we look at the laws. So we see that now we're in these laws here. And then if we look at Deuteronomy 24, verse 10 for the next law, it's Deuteronomy 24, verse 10. You're just looking at this out of all of interest, having a good Bible study, looking through the laws that we're not going to obey because we can't. And we see here, this one's going to talk about not to exact a pledge from a debtor. You're not going to do it by force if someone can't pay it or whatever it is. It says, when thou dost lend thy brother anything, thou shalt not go into his house to fetch his pledge. So you're not going to, when it comes time to get back what you're owed, and your brother, in this case, Israel, they're kind of slacking on the payback. You're not going to barge into his house and say, hey, it's time to pay up. I'm getting what I need. I'm getting my payback. I'm going back in. There's a law saying can't do that. So we say this is when thou dost lend thy brother anything, thou shalt not go into his house to fetch his pledge. So, if someone says, okay, I gave you XYZ on Tuesday, pay me back on Thursday, and it's Friday, you can't barge in. It's against the law. You can't, you can probably go and have a conversation or something, but to barge in and try to get it back, can't do that. It's against Levitical law. It's against the law of Moses, against the law of God. So we see that there in Deuteronomy 24:10. So if we look at Deuteronomy 15, verse 8, I believe we've got a cross-reference for that as well. If anything, this is something more dealing with the actions, dealing with commerce and transactions and business. And if anything, it just says that thou shalt open thine hand wide unto him, and thou shalt surely lend him sufficient for his need and that which he wanteth. So we're seeing just, open your hand wide unto them. And if they didn't pay it back, there's other means of dealing with this. But it's not that you're going to barge in and you're going to break in and you're going to, rush in and do this. There's going to be another law. There's going to be another way where equality and justice is done. So it's not that they will get away scot-free, because God is the avenger of all such, especially in prophecy where he has means of getting things done through all sorts of interaction. So So we see that there. We look at Deuteronomy 24:12. Well, we're here in Deuteronomy 24:12. What we see here is not to keep the pledge from the owner at the time when he needs it. It says, if the man be poor, thou shalt not sleep with his pledge. In other words, if he's poor, you're not going to just hang on to. If you can't, if you want to, if the man wants XYZ, this Hebrew wants XYZ, you're not going to hang on to it until he's ready to pay. In other words, you're not going to sleep overnight hanging on to something somebody needs. You'll find a way to work it out. You'll find a way to make some sort of agreement. You're not just going to sleep when you could do your Hebrew brother some good. There's a way to make it work. There's a way to turn this around. You're not going to sleep on the job, in other words. You're not going to sleep on it. You're going to make some way to make this work. There's going to be some other way. You're not going to sleep with this pledge. You're going to find a way to make this transaction, pan out. So we see that there. We look at just two verses down. We saw this a little bit earlier. Deuteronomy 24:15 says that at his day thou shalt give him his hire, and neither shall the sun go down upon it. There's that phrase again. Neither shall the sun go down upon it, for he is poor, and setteth his heart upon it, lest he cry unto thee against thee unto the Lord, and it be sin unto thee. So we're seeing that if you were to sleep on the job or sleep on the pledge that the poor Hebrew wanted, and say, well, I'm not giving my money to this poor Hebrew because I know he can't pay it back to me, but I know he wants to make a business transaction with me. It says in verse 15 that poor Hebrew could cry out to the Lord, and you could have some sin against you because you're breaking some laws. Again, not you as in any of us here, but in the example that we're talking about. We're seeing that Hebrew who's resting on doing his brother some good is breaking some Levitical laws here, so breaking some business laws, breaking the laws of God by not helping out his brother. And if that poor Hebrew cries out to the Lord, Lord could very easily hear him. And now the other guy's in trouble. So obeying the law does Israel some good. So we saw that in verse 15. And it says there in verse 15, I'm sorry, it was verse 14. And then, prior to that, verse 13. It shall be righteousness unto thee before the Lord thy God. That reminds me of Deuteronomy 6:25, where they explain before the Lord as they talk about the laws as a whole. Deuteronomy 6:25. As they talk about the entire 613 points of law, we saw from this law here, Deuteronomy 24:13, it said that it shall be righteousness unto thee before the Lord thy God. Deuteronomy 6:25 goes on saying, it shall be our righteousness if we observe to do all these commandments before the Lord our God as he hath commanded us. And of course, they have to include the word if because it's a covenant standing. If they do this, there will be blessings. If they fail, there will be cursings. And so there's not a eternal security mentioning in there at all. It's a matter of works. It's a matter of having faith in what's being here, and then faith plus works. Faith in what's here, the covenants and the laws. Works would follow as a result of their faith. So it'd be a matter of faith plus works. This is James chapter. Righteousness, not their salvation, but their righteousness, and their righteousness could be temporary standing, a conditional standing, if we observe to do all these commandments. So the more they do, the more they'll have, but if they falter, and when they falter, they lose it. So we see these interesting laws here, and we're looking at these here. Find some more that we're going through. I believe it was debted by force, not to keep the pledge from Lord at the time when he needs it. That's the next one. That's Deuteronomy 24:12. If a man be poor, thou shalt not sleep with his pledge. I believe we saw that one. But this one also talks about it here. not to keep the pledge from his owner at the time when he needs it. Even Job talks about this. He makes mention of this concept. He says, not to keep the pledge from its owner at the time when he needs it. Shall seek this pledge. Look at Job 22, verse 6. We'll find an interesting, just some things that Job has to say, or the book of Job has to say, because I believe it's going to be Eliphaz, the Temanite, talking here. And he's pretty much speaking to Job and everyone else in that crowd. And he says, "For thou hast taken a pledge from thy brother for naught, and stripped the naked of their clothing." And he's going forth and he's saying all these things, thinking that Job's done wrong, and this is what things have happened to him. He said, "For thou hast taken a pledge for thy brother for naught," going back to the pledge and everything else. And so he's saying this here. If we look at furthermore, Job 24, that's Job 24, verse 3. And as we go through here, he says, as the conversation continues, he says, "They drive away the ass of the fatherless. They take the widow's ox for a pledge." I'm talking more about the concept of a pledge. Goes on and talks about this. And then we look at verse 9. It says, "They pluck the fatherless from the breast and take a pledge of the poor." So he's talking about the wicked and those that say deserve God's wrath or punishment or whatever. But you're seeing those that they take a pledge from the poor. They do that which is wrong. They would go in and barge into the poor's place and take that they shouldn't, and do all the things that are wrong. So even in Job's day, he talked about this. There was no official Levitical law. There was no Israel. There was none of this in Job's day. But the concepts that it was wrong to do certain things concerning business practices and usuries and pledges and everything else was wrong even in Job's day. And it just continues on when it comes to the concepts of Levitical law and business practices and everything else. So we're seeing this play out here. So this goes with Deuteronomy 24:12. And to return, let's see, verse 13, Deuteronomy 24:13. As we go there, it says, "In any case, thou shalt deliver him the pledge again when the sun goeth down." And we're seeing a lot of verses again with the sun goeth down, so that's a good point in the day. We saw a couple verses so far, interestingly enough, where the sun goeth down, and that was the point in time where things had to be wrapped up. We keep coming across it. So again, I would plug that into Ephesians. I believe it's 5:29 or Ephesians 6, where don't let the sun go down upon your wrath. You see a lot in the law. Maybe use a concordance and see where you can find more about the sun going down. In any case, thou shalt deliver him the pledge again when the sun goeth down, that he may sleep in his own raiment, and bless thee, and it shall be righteousness unto thee before the Lord thy God. And so in this case, what we're seeing here is to return a pledge unto his owner. This was something that was mentioned here, and we looked at this just a moment ago in Deuteronomy 24:15 and Deuteronomy 6:25. That was what we saw there. But if we look 4 verses down in Deuteronomy 24, verse 17, and it's going to be more towards the latter part of the verse, but the whole verse says, "Thou shalt not pervert the judgment of a stranger, nor of the fatherless, nor take a widow's raiment to pledge." So again, we saw it adds a little bit more to what we were seeing before. You're not to take somebody's clothing, you're not to take somebody's millstone, you're not to do this, especially when it comes to the idea of a widow. If a widow needs money or whatever it is, food, raiment, some sort of business transaction that a Hebrew widow is going to go out and do because she needs it, you're not going to go back and take her clothing as a result of getting some payback. So it says, "Nor take a widow's raiment to pledge." It's not going to do that. That's a law. On top of that being something that's not to be done, it's a law. So that's Deuteronomy 24, verse 17. And we see this again. If we look at Jeremiah 22, verse 3, we see by then, of course, Israel's corrupt. And one thing they do is they go after the fatherless, they go after the widow. They're going after anything they can to get what they can. Jeremiah 22, verse 3. It says, thus saith the Lord, execute ye judgment and righteousness, and deliver the spoiled out of the hand of the oppressor, and do no wrong, do no violence to the stranger, fatherless, nor the widow, which is where we're looking at. Neither shed innocent blood in this place. So we're seeing the widow being something where, thus saith the Lord, execute judgment. Don't go after the fatherless. Don't go after the widow. That's kind of what we're seeing here in Deuteronomy. So this plugs in here. If you look at Jeremiah 49, verse 11. We head more towards the end of this. Jeremiah 49, verse 11. More about the widow. It says, leave thy fatherless children, I will preserve them alive, and let thy widows trust in me. So he's saying let the widows trust in the Lord. For thus saith the Lord, behold, they whose judgment was not to drink of the cup have assuredly drunken, and art thou he that shall altogether go unpunished? Thou shalt not go unpunished, but thou shalt surely drink of it. So we're seeing there that let the widows trust in me, what God says, and don't oppress them. Don't hold them back. There's laws protecting widows. Don't take their raiment as a pledge. Don't take any of these other things to have to do. Allow the widows to be protected. It's Hebrew widows that we're seeing here. So we see that there. And then as we move on into more about equal balances, equal measurements, that's Leviticus 19, verse 35. I believe we did a study on something similar to this a while ago. Maybe we were just looking at ephah. I think we were looking at ephahs and gerahs and different Levitical measurements. But nonetheless, we're coming back to it a couple months later. And that's Leviticus 19, verse 35. It's interesting to see these laws that they had to keep, and we can't keep this. It says here, Leviticus 19:35, that ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment, in midyard, in weight, or in measure. Now, again, we can learn from that. There's nothing wrong with that. We should have no unrighteousness in judgment. And no, but of course, how many times have you made a bad judgment call? Again, to do that here is breaking the law. But it says, especially in business, but it says in judgment, in midyard, in weight, or in measure. Just balances, just weights, a just ephah, and a just hin shall ye have. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. The Hebrews were the ones brought out of the land of Egypt. We could read about it all in the book of Exodus. So see that there in verse 35 and verse 36. So see that there, and even if we back up 20 verses into Leviticus 19, verse 15. So ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. There it is again. Thou shalt not respect the person of the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty, but in righteousness shalt thou judge thy neighbor. So when it comes to the idea of upholding one person more so above another because they have more or less money than the other, if you make in other words, if you have a business transaction or you have a business, whatever it is, whatever's going on in Israel at this time, whether it's dealing with cattle or dealing with bulls and goats and turtle doves, whatever it may be, you treat the poor as you treat the rich. You treat them equal and balanced, and you treat them fair, and you treat them right, and you treat everybody the same as far as how you're going to work with them equally. You're not going to show one group of people favor over another just because you feel like it. There's to be equality in how you deal with all your customers, whatever. Everything's to be equal. A just hin, a just balance. You should have no unrighteousness in judgment. You're not to respect the person of the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. So they said, remember the poor, but those were the poor when it came to, giving, say donation or whatever it was. This is talking about showing favor or making sure that someone gets a little more than the other person on purpose. So there's something to be said about protecting the poor over, sliding an extra 10% this way or an extra 15% that way in business practices. So there's one versus the other, but we're seeing it here in the laws and the rules saying how they were to keep everything equal, keep everything just. We look at Amos, chapter 8, verse 5. Of course, by the time you get to Amos, Israel's a fallen society. Amos chapter 8, verse 5. There's everything from famine to everything else, so Israel gets worried about it. See, hear this, O ye that swallow up the needy, even to make the poor of the land to fail. That's verse 4. Saying, when will the new moon be gone, that we may sell corn, and the Sabbath, that we may set forth wheat, making the ephah small and the shekel great, and falsifying the balances by deceit. So they're saying, when can we do these things? When can we go ahead and make the shekel, one way, and the ephah small another way? And when can we start falsifying the balances? When can we start, cheating everybody so we can get favor, we can get rich? And he's saying, when will the new moon be gone that we may sell corn? When are these times going to come to pass so we can go ahead and falsify the balances? This is what Israel's saying. This is the Israel who's supposed to be obeying Leviticus and Exodus and Deuteronomy and Numbers and everything else. Now they're saying, when can we go ahead and falsify the balances? When is this new moon going to pass? So we can go ahead and falsify the balances. He says, verse 6, that we may buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of shoes, yea, and sell the refuse of the wheat. So they're saying those things in verse 6, saying, we want to buy the poor for silver, and we want to buy the needy for a pair of shoes. So we're seeing how corrupt Israel becomes as a society, and Amos, God's man on the scene, calls them out on it and tells them, the last thing you're obeying is the laws of God. The last thing you are a Levitical, kingdom of priests who's obeying the law. You're not doing that. So we see that there. And he's saying, we hear you're saying, Israel, that you're looking to falsify the balances. So those are not good business transactions. We hear it, we see it, we know it. And the last thing you're obeying is what you said you'd obey in Exodus 19. So we see that there, not to commit fraud in measuring. And that's what we read. So we've gone through most of it. We've got about three more interesting laws here. But we go to Leviticus 19:36, which is essentially more about what we just read: just balances, just weights, a just ephah, and a just hin shall ye have. And so it's ensuring that the scales and the weights are correct that they're using for business transactions. Again, talking just again about the concept that everything is fair and balanced, just and right, wholesome for a business transaction. If you got a scale, make sure it's correct. If you got a weight, whatever, just make sure it's fair and it's going to produce a right measurement or a right weight so that it does what it should. If you look at, say, Proverbs 20, verse 10. Proverbs 20:10, I believe even Proverbs talks about how right weights and everything were a good thing, and false weights were an abomination. Proverbs 20:10. Yeah, diverse weights and diverse measures, both of them are alike abomination to the Lord. So we see that there in Proverbs 20:10. And there's a couple other Proverbs that talk about the same thing. As if we were to go through and do Proverbs again, theme by theme, we'd probably come across this as one of the themes where, right weights, just weights are good, and finding diverse weights and diverse measures, they're an abomination. So, because again, everything would be jumbled and unfair, and it'd be corrupt. And corruption is sin, and that wouldn't be right. So, if you think of any business that's corrupt, it's sin, and therefore you're finding that most of what you're finding in most nations today concerning business will not be a right thing under law. But nonetheless, that's why we're not under law today. So you see that there. And this we're seeing when we look at these ideas here, concerning scales and weights and everything else. And let's see, Deuteronomy 25:13. I believe that's where we saw this a little bit earlier. Deuteronomy 25:13, 14. It's just talking about the same thing as we go through the laws that are talking about the same thing. Deuteronomy 25:13, thou shalt not have in thy bag diverse weights, a great and a small. Thou shalt not have in thine house diverse measures, a great and a small, equal, just, and fair. Nothing diverse when it comes to their weights and corrupt that would throw somebody off. Now we see that there. And we see, if you look at even at Micah chapter 6, verse 11. By the time you get to Micah, just as you get to Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Amos, everything's corrupt. So these are the prophets that call everybody out on that. And let's see, that's Micah chapter 6, verse 11. Of course, this is exactly what he calls out Israel on. You would read this in the law and you would say, well, where would this ever come up again? This isn't going to come up again. This is such a thing that I never see in my society today. Well, this is Israel, and the Bible is referring to Israel and prophecy in their society through 47 books, and then we have ours and our 13 books. So we see here in Micah 6:11, shall I count them pure with the wicked balances and with the bag of deceitful weights? I mean, we just read that. We just read those laws in Deuteronomy, Leviticus, Exodus. Shall I count them pure with the wicked balances and with the bag of deceitful weights? For the rich men thereof are full of violence, and the inhabitants thereof have spoken lies, and their tongue is deceitful in their mouth. Therefore also will I make thee sick in smiting thee, and making thee desolate because of thy sins. Thou shalt eat, but not be satisfied. That sounds like one of the courses of judgment we went over the other time. Thou shalt eat, but not be satisfied, which is going to roll right into those courses. And thy casting down shall be in the midst of thee, and thou shalt take hold, but shalt not deliver. And that which thou deliverest will I give up to the sword. It's a course of judgment. Micah is the one proclaiming it as they roll into the next course of judgment, based on the fact that they have, and they're operating with, deceitful weights, deceitful balances, on top of many other sins. Because there's 613 points of law. This is just a few of them that they're breaking. And Micah's calling them out on. So we see this here. And again, it's just interesting to go through, see the laws, and then you go through and you see what they're breaking. You see why Micah would say something about, diverse weights, or why Ezekiel will call them out on usury. And you know that until we go through and we look at the laws, and you see them pop up in Micah and Ezekiel, Jeremiah and Isaiah, and even Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And as we see what the laws are, you see why they're broken, how they're broken, and recourse for it. So we're seeing this play out here in all these different verses. So then we'll get into this next one. And I just kind of added this in. I mean, these are laws, but yet it's also a lesson all in itself. So we won't go too deep in it. And we'll kind of, if anything, if we have a little bit of time, we'll see if we can go further than this, but we'll see. It's about the tithe. And tithe is a law. But a lot of people say that the tithing is giving 10% of your money church every Sunday. That's not going to fit because we can't find that anywhere in the Bible. But when we go and we take a look and we see what the tithe is, we'll start out in Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 30.
I don't think that's right. Because there's no verse 30.
Let me see. Probably do have it wrong, don't I? Yeah, I do have it wrong. Okay. Let's do
20.
No, it was, that can't be right. Well, I did see one earlier, so if it's not 27, interesting. I wrote down the wrong.
You know the verses.
Yeah, ran out of verses. Let's see if I can find where I had it. Yeah, Deuteronomy. We'll come back to that then. Let's see if I can find it. Let's try Deuteronomy 14 then. Deuteronomy 14, 26 through 28, and we'll kind of we can come back to it. 14, 26. But what we're seeing here is that this, when we look at the tithe, you're going to see it's talking to something that is not going to be referring to as money, at least not primarily. Deuteronomy 14, verse 26. And it says, and thou shalt bestow that money for whatsoever thy soul lusteth after, for oxen and for sheep and for wine and for strong drink and for whatsoever thy soul desireth, and thou shalt eat there before the Lord thy God, and thou shalt rejoice, thou and thine household. So if I look up something real quick, I'm going to go into my concordance, see what I can find here, and see if I can retrace the verse that I boggled there. But pretty much what we're finding here is just this one verse here talks about a tithe where you can look up whatever your soul lusts after. And in this case, you're seeing this in Deuteronomy 14, verse 27. Let's see. And of course, this one is talking about money, so it's money concerning whatever your soul lusts after. Let's see if I can jump through it real quick. Leviticus 27, verse 30. Let's try Leviticus 27, verse 30. Leviticus 27, that's probably it. Leviticus 27, verse 30. Probably typed in Deuteronomy instead of Leviticus. Yeah, there it is. So I'm going to fix that.
Little typo.
Yeah, I had Deuteronomy on my mind when it should have been Leviticus. And so what we see here, we saw that when they're talking about the tithe where you give whatever you want based upon whatever your soul lusts after, that's one tithe. For you, whether it's strong drink or food or cattle or whatever it is you feel like, that's one tithe. This one here in Leviticus 27, verse 30 says, and all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is holy unto the Lord's. And if a man will at all redeem aught of his tithes, he shall add thereto the fifth part thereof. And concerning the tithe of the herd or of the flock, even whatsoever passeth under the rod, a tenth shall be holy unto the Lord. He shall not search whether it be good or bad, or so on and so forth. But you're seeing here what the tithe is. And on top of the one where you give to your soul whatever your soul lusts after, you kind of take and do whatever you want with it. That's one. You're seeing here tithe is a result of the seed of the land, or the fruit of the tree, or your crops, in other words. That's in verse 30. Then you look and you see in verse 32, tithe of the herd or the flock. So it's either crops or cattle. So you can give a tenth of the crops, a tenth of the cattle, or you can give that tenth to yourself, where you're donating and you're doing this as a result of whatsoever thy soul lusteth after. Tithe has nothing to do with showing up at church on Sunday and giving 10% of everything you make. You're seeing it is giving, as you see, a tenth shall be holy unto the Lord, but you're seeing that you're giving, or Israel is giving, some of it to the seed of the land or the fruit of the tree. Do you show up to church on Sunday giving some of the fruit of the trees you have? And some people may say, well, some strange cases they do, but then you show up and give some of the cattle on top of some of the land all the time. And then do you keep some of that and do whatever you want with it? But on top of that, there's a certain place you have to put it. And that's Numbers 18, verse, and if it's not Numbers 18, it's Deuteronomy 12. We've got a couple of verses here. Numbers 18, verse 21 just continues on with tithing verses. Numbers 18, verse 21. When we see the laws about the tithing, it's nothing about showing up to church on Sunday with 10% of what you did all past 2 weeks, your paycheck. Numbers 18, 21. It says, behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tenth in Israel for an inheritance, for their service which they serve, even the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. Neither must the children of Israel henceforth come nigh to the tabernacle of the congregation, lest they bear sin and die. But the Levites shall do the service. So it's talking about giving something to the Levites. And so when you show up and you give, you're giving some of what you have, whether it be crops, whether it be cattle, or whatever it is, you're giving some of it to the Levites. You're giving some, which is a law, which we don't have. We don't have Levites today. But some of your crops go to the Levites. Have we ever shown up anywhere and given our crops to the Levites? Of course not, but that's a law. That would be part of the tithing. And some of it is, again, another tithe where you give whatever you want to yourself. You give some of it to the Levites, crops or otherwise, or cattle. And then there's another one where I believe you give to the temple. Let me see if I can find that. Deuteronomy 12, verse 5. Deuteronomy 12, verse 5. Let me see what that one has to say there. Business laws and commerce and money and everything else. 12:5. There we go. But unto the place which the Lord your God shall choose out of all your tribes to put his name there, even unto his habitation shall ye seek, and thither thou shalt come. And thither ye shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices and your tithe, and heave offerings of your hand, and your vows and your freewill offerings, and the firstlings of your herds and of your flocks. So when you show up to bring your tithes, and when you show up to bring your tithes to of your crops and of your cattle to the Levites, you're to show up specifically at a specific spot at the temple. Now, if you don't show up at a specific spot at the temple with your crops and your herds to the Levites, you're breaking the law. That's very different from showing up on Sunday at 10 o'clock with 10% of your paycheck. It's extreme because you can't find that here in the Bible. But I can find somebody who needs to show up with some of their crops and their cattle to a Levite at the temple. Look at Deuteronomy 12, as we look at Numbers 18, Deuteronomy 14, and Leviticus 27, what the laws are. And see if it continues on. Yeah, and so this is what we find here when we're looking at different things concerning business, money, tithing, the legal business practices and otherwise. The tithe, I kind of just threw the tithe in there at the end, concerning crops, even one for yourself. And that you bring it specifically to a specific group of people in a specific place. Now, today people would say, and they would spin it to say, well, we're the Levites, and this church is the temple. And of course, that's them just twisting the scriptures to make it sound like it's a place where you need to bring your money so they can get rich. But again, that's them spinning the verses in twisting everything into their agenda. But nonetheless, there were actual literal Levites, priests of Israel, who were going to receive crops, cattle, and otherwise. So we see that there. And you can even see when it concerning the tithe, if you go to Matthew chapter 23, when the Lord himself showed up, he scolded the Pharisees bitterly because they were all focused on the wrong things. When it came to business, when it came to tithes, when it came to everything else, in Leviticus 23, he was the first one to yell at them and say, you guys are focused on all the wrong things. You guys are putting these guys under such bondage. You're putting Israel under such bondage. And he said, woe to you, unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye pay tithes of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These all ye have done, and not to have left the other undone. Ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Thou blind Pharisee, cleanse first that which is within the cup and the platter, or the platter, and platter, that the outside of them may be clean also. So we're seeing him talking there, saying you're full of extortion, Pharisees, and that you've omitted the weightier matters of the law. So when you want to show somebody, this is a good lesson. If you want to show somebody that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's all about the law, it's not about grace, there's no Paul, then you can show them Leviticus go through these business laws, whether we studied tonight, Leviticus 19, Deuteronomy, Numbers, so on and so forth, and then take them to Matthew 23 and say, why is the Lord talking to the Pharisees all the way into Matthew 23, which is past Matthew 5, 6, and 7, Sermon on the Mount, heading into Matthew 24, all about the ages to come, which will match up with the Israel's ages to come, which will match up with the book of Revelation. And why is he talking about the law in Matthew 23, the weightier matters of the law, which is going to match up with everything we've just studied for the past hour? So we see that there, and we're seeing what the laws are. So we see these Levitical business practice laws. And so as we see, and we go through this here, we see that sacrifices need to be made for this. As people continuously not only break the laws we've looked at tonight, we looked at about 15 of them. But if you kind of add into what we went through last week, and we went through the other 10, the other 14, and I mean, there's 613 of them. But if we remember, we went through, again, if you add in what we just did with what we went through last week, just on that alone, that makes about, I'd say about 30 or so laws, give or take. You think about the ones about Levitical brotherhood, where we're saying, to rebuke the sinner and to not take revenge and to love the neighbor as yourself. If you had a beast that fell down, you to help your brother with the beast, help get him out of the. If you had an enemy, you were to help the enemy with the beast, help them out and bring them out of their problems. Those were not suggestions; those were laws. Those were commandments. And you can ask somebody, "Are you doing that today?" And then as you go and you look at these business practices, you can say, "Well, our business is doing that today. Are you doing that today? Have you joined up and worked at a business that has done this today?" Right? Does that mean that we're all guilty before God today? And Romans 3:19 says, yes, the law makes us all guilty. The law is the knowledge of sin. It's not salvation from sin. It's the knowledge of sin. And that's why we're looking at this. We're just looking at this and we're understanding, wow, try to put yourself under the law. It's a terrible burden. It's a horrific, burden for us. But the law is holy. The law itself is holy, just, and good. And by the law is the knowledge of sin. So it's an interesting study to see what Israel had to do, what Israel's laws were, what Israel's laws were to be. But again, the question comes back to, if you let me keep my commandments, can we keep these commandments? All of them? Perfectly all the time? No. It's just not going to work. We're just looking at them one by one in the setting of a theme. Business practices, Levitical brotherhood, study after study, and we're finding these are deep laws. These are tough, to constantly keep. But yeah, we can learn from them. We can take a lot of beneficial, wise studies from them, learn about them, and be better ambassadors proclaiming grace and the dispensation of grace. So we see that there. And I think it's a good time to wrap up, see if there's any kind of thoughts or comments on anything we just went through. And we'll kind of go into another study on a Sunday. Laws, we'll go through 2 more studies, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. We don't want to stay in the law forever. So it's good to go through it and just take an examination of it. So, any thoughts or comments? We'll open it up for anybody.
So you cannot follow all of them,
Yeah, you can't follow.
especially the tithing.
Yeah, especially the tithing. Yeah. A lot of people that say that they are tithing, and they're tithing 10% every Sunday or every whatever it is, don't understand what tithing actually is, what it actually is supposed to be, crops and cattle going to a Jewish priest in the middle of their temple.
I'm glad we're not part of that.
Yeah. You have to bring your caravan.
Yeah. Or every paycheck every Sunday they deduct your.
Yeah, and a lot of the denominations now have that ATM and all that.
And they will know you.
Draw from your checking
They will know
account.
you.
Yeah.
They will coming you.
Yeah, a lot of Christian circles, so-called Christian circles, the more you pay, the more they want to get to know you, and the less you pay, the And that was breaking one of the laws we looked at where it said you're not to treat someone who is poor more than the rich or whatever it was. You go to a church today, quote unquote, depending on what the Christian denomination, whatever it is, some pastors, quote unquote, they won't even talk to you if you don't give them. Yeah, you know, you've been to a couple.
Yeah.
They won't even speak to you if you're not putting something in the basket.
If I put $1.
If you put $1, whatever, if you don't even give them anything or you don't give them a lot of anything, they don't want to know you.
But on the flip side, we've seen a lot of people that do throw a lot of money, and if they're not being honored and treated as special, you know, especially they'll leave and go to someplace else that would.
Yeah.
So.
I do have a question I want to ask you. You referenced Job tonight. Job is one of the earliest books. Yeah, that's correct. Yet in Job, Eliphaz the Temanite was getting on Job. Thou hast taken a pledge from thy brother for naught, and stripped them naked of their clothing. Thou hast not given water nor to drink, and so forth. These are laws appearing in Job, but they're not laws. Not at the
There's a lot you can find in Genesis and in Job where there are things that God is doing because it's a dispensation of promise and there is no Israel, there is no laws. Yeah. And yet God is God and God is doing, like you find in Cain and Abel, there's animal sacrifices and Abel offers up the right animal sacrifice. Cain offers up, his vegetables. And God's saying, look, I want an animal sacrifice. And he's saying it to Cain and Abel, the third and fourth person to ever exist. And then animal sacrifices move forth with Noah, and then they move forth into Israel. And then laws are created saying, okay, specifically, here's what the laws are going to be, clean and unclean animals. But there's Cain and Abel offering animal sacrifices. There's Noah putting in clean and unclean animals into the ark. But that's just the animals. But then you get also, as you said, you see Job talking about usury, interest. Eliphaz saying, what, you charge interest in these guys? Is that why you're being punished? You charge interest and usury? You're doing this? Is this why you had all this death and famine happen to you, Job? But they're talking about these themes before there's ever an Israel, before there's ever laws about usury or animal sacrifices. But these are things taking place where God is showing that there's even... who's the priest where Abraham offers Melchizedek? Melchizedek is a priest. Later on you get a whole bunch of priests. You get a kingdom of priests. But you've got a priest, you got animal sacrifices, you get mentioning of usury, you get all these different things coming up all the way back to the dispensation of promise, where there are things that God is doing and things are happening and things are there. But there's no Israel, there's no nation, there's no God's timeline is still moving along. The prophecy program is being established, but God is still saying, I'm still God. I want this done. This is what I want. This is what I've commanded.
So I guess the question I would ask is, when you read something like this in Job, would you understand that God was speaking to these people even back then? Or when Israel came on the scene and God put the law in for them, was it just kind of a random thing that he did at the time for Israel only, and these other places where it says about pledges and usury and so forth and so on, was that just part of the way they lived back then?
Well, some of it is the way they live, but God wasn't setting up a nation yet. He took specifically Abraham, just like he took specifically Paul with the dispensation of grace and everything like that. That was God's intentional man on the scene. He wanted Saul of Tarsus, the worst, to be Paul and the pattern. So he takes Abraham. He wants Abram to be Abraham, the one he's going to use to set up a nation with. He didn't want Job to be the one he sets up a nation with. He didn't want Abel to be the one he sets up a nation with. So he wanted Abraham specifically. Yeah, Isaac and Jacob. And then he sets up the nation and descendants of Abraham to set up a nation with rules and laws and covenants and statutes and everything else.
But obviously, this being considered the oldest book in Scripture, I mean, some of the same things like the pledge and all that stuff still applied. I mean, they still
As far as the
understood.
concepts, yeah, the concepts are still there. As far as it's wrong to put on usury and all these other things, yeah. I mean, you still see the devil in there, you know, check the
first one.
Yeah, they're all still there. I mean, everything's still, you know, God is still God, devil's still the devil. Creation is still creation. It's all still, you know, it's just there are some things that have not moved along in God's timeline yet in the book of Job, but it's all still valid. I mean, the concepts that God wants to be presented, you know.
So as part of your question, how did they know?
Because I mean, remember, God speaks to him. God speaks to Job at the end of the book of Job. So
Yeah.
God must have spoken audibly.
When you look at the verse further, chapter 22, when you look at verse 22, it says, receive, I pray thee, the law from his mouth and lay up his words in thine heart.
Yeah.
But he's not talking about the law that, like, the law that ordinances and commandments that God is giving the nation.
It could be more so commandment. Yeah, it wouldn't be a nation if there is no nation. Not at that time. But it could be how God speaks to individual people. Job and, you know, he's spoken, as you read in the book of Genesis, he speaks to people and has them do things like he tells that certain king, if you touch Abraham's wife, you know, you're in big trouble. He speaks to other people in Genesis, individuals, you know, things like that. So
maybe that's why some people think he's talking to us now as individuals. Who knows?
Oh, because people probably read halfway through the book of Genesis and say, all right,
He's talking to them. Why can't he talk to me?
Yeah. Some people may think like that. Yeah. Some people might. Absolutely. See? Didn't know if anyone had any other thoughts or anything. It was interesting to go through and read these laws, and we'll do two more studies. We'll see about doing one. I think I've already got one set up. It'll be on agriculture and animals. You know, finding a bird's nest, you know, laws on that, animals, agriculture, that'll be Sunday. And then we'll kind of work on some for one more time on Wednesday. I think that'll be it. So, don't know if anyone had anything else. We can wrap up here right at 8:30. We got the chat room open and go from there.
See you all Sunday.
Yeah, we'll see you on
Have a
Sunday.
good night.
Good night.